Bom dia a todos. Nós vamos dar, então, as boas-vindas ao professor Edward Schoolman, da University of Nevada, que vai fazer, então, a aula inaugural do nosso ano acadêmico do Programa de Pós-Graduação em História. E ele vai apresentar para a gente uma palestra intitulada Remembering Medieval Emperors in Image, Object and Text. Passo a palavra para ele agora.
Thank you very much. That's very, very loud. So, before I begin, I would like to thank my host for allowing me to present in this inaugural lecture, Professor Patricia Meneses, for her unwavering friendship, and her colleagues and students here at Unicamp for their warm welcome. I feel truly lucky to have the opportunity to present my research at this venue. So, the topic of my presentation today is the way in which object, image, and text were put to use to connect and bind medieval emperors together in memory as a means to add further legitimacy to their reigns and to tap into the iconography and language of imperial authority. So the main argument for this talk, the takeaway, so if you want to leave now after I say it, will be that for medieval and even post-medieval emperors, those who began their rule after 800 and were politically disconnected from the Roman Empire, memorialization reflected aspects of both imperial Rome and later Christian and sacral rulership in parallel and even in discordant ways. But it was the imperial Roman that was central. That's the takeaway. But to get there, we have to do some investigation. 3 figures will dominate this talk. First, Charles the Great, Carlos Magno or Charlemagne, who became king of the Franks in 768 and emperor in 800, and later has been called the father of Europe on account of the kingdom he established for his descendants, being understood as the precursors to the medieval and early modern nations of Europe. Charles was an adopter of both the iconography and language of empire, employing elements of imperial Rome in his production, as well as becoming himself the target of adoption for later successors. His close connection to the church in Rome and efforts to paint his life both as in terms of military conquest and religious piety led to a very political canonization in 1165 by Frederick I, in which he was included as a saintly figure as well as a medieval ruler. This continues on for centuries. For example, the portrait of Charles the Great could be used to legitimize a later king, such as this panel by Albrecht Dürer, painted just after 510, in which the Frankish ruler, the later father of France and Germany, as we can see by the shields, is placed in parallel with the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, who ruled from 1410 to 1437 and over 5 distinct territories. This is the German Empire, Bohemia, both Hungaries, and Luxembourg. On the other hand, Master Theodoric of Prague created a portrait of Charles in 1360 with a halo rather than a crown, and in simple robes rather than in sort of imperial regalia, to emphasize his holy stature, although set against the double eagle of the German kingdom displayed on his shield. In literature as well, we find the pull between Charles the Great as charismatic leader reflected in the stories related to Roland that began to circulate in the 11th century and codified in the Chansons de Roland, and more traditional biographies, which ended up being included with those of saints and martyrs. Indeed, it is this aspect that we can understand the saintly in the portrait of Master Theodoric. And the panel was destined for a church in Prague dedicated to both the Assumption of the Virgin and to Charles the Great as saint, in a move to lend greater legitimacy and sanctity to a city that had become central to the Holy Roman Empire. And this is Prague, as the capital of Bohemia in the 14th century. not important for the rest of the lecture. However, both these interpretations of Charles the Great as a militaristic hero emperor on the one hand and a saintly king on the other were natural descendants. They evolved from the efforts of two other figures that are central to this presentation. I've mentioned three figures: Charles the Great. The other two are Frederick I Barbarossa, who was Holy Roman Emperor from 1155 to 1190, and his grandson, Frederick II, who became emperor in 1220 and ruled a vast territorial dominion that included Germany, Sicily, and ultimately the Kingdom of Jerusalem until 1250. In particular, both of these Holy Roman emperors sought to create for themselves objects that incorporated both the holy and the imperial, in image, in text, and even in the body itself, of the body himself of Charles the Great. Their interest was not in that they were the direct descendants of the Frankish king. In fact, they were not related at all, or even in some continuity of their imperial dominions. They had very different empires, and their dominions were radically different in terms of organization and in the geographical composition, as we can see here between Charlemagne's empire in 800 and in 1200 the Holy Roman Empire, so vastly different territories. It was instead that Charles the Great represented the first medieval emperor who warranted both veneration and imitation, and was certainly also worthy of remembrance on a number of levels. So the core will be two objects, and they're a little hard to see. So when we're done with the presentation, take out your phone and you can Google these. They're amazing. Well, the first is a reliquary arm of Charles, crafted in Liège in 1165 under the orders of Frederick Barbarossa, and what is known as the Karl Shrine on the bottom, a sarcophagus for Charles's entire body, installed in the royal chapel of Aachen by Frederick II as part of his own coronation. And these represent the height of this kind of active commemoration and memorialization. I think to understand the power of these objects had in revisiting the legend of Charles the Great and how medieval emperors were remembered, we need to trace the ways in which Charles the Great himself began the process by adopting and modifying the memory of his own imperial Roman predecessors. But first, to begin to understand, we must first turn to the coronation of Charles the Great as emperor. An important event. On Christmas of the year 800, Charles the Great, Rex Francorum, King of the Franks, allowed himself to be crowned Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. He was on his third trip to Italy, having deposed the last Lombard king in 774, and thus secured the northern half of the Italian peninsula for his expanding domain. While in Rome, he was tricked, almost, and he allowed the Pope to perform a ceremony where, having been dressed in the style of a Roman, the Frankish king was invested and anointed with the title of emperor, becoming the first man to hold the title in Western Europe since the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476. And this is the event, the coronation of Charles the Great, had reverberations for both the papacy and secular rulers in Europe for centuries. And here's an example of a fresco of Raphael in the Apostolic Palace in Rome, in the Vatican, again highlighting the connection between the Church of Rome and these emperors, these new emperors. In the Middle Ages, Charles's near contemporary biographers, Einhard and Nochter, memorialized the event in their biographies of the king. Einhard described how Charles, having come to the aid of Pope Leo, because Pope Leo was in big trouble, if you know Einhard, he received the titles of Emperor and Augustus, to which he at first had such an aversion. He was terrified, he was upset, that he declared he would not have set foot in the church that day they were conferred, although it was a great feast day, if he had foreseen the plans, the designs of the Pope. Noctor the Stammerer, writing a little more than a generation, maybe a little less than a generation later, embellished the story with a few more details. Charles stayed in Rome for a few days, and the bishops all gathered together, and they came from neighboring districts. And in the presence of all the equites, the knights of the unconquered Charles, this is going back to more imperial titles, declared him to be emperor and defender of the Roman Church. Now, Charles had no guess of what was coming, and though he could not refuse what seemed to have been divinely preordained for him, he nevertheless received his new title with no show of thankfulness. He was unhappy to be forced to have the title of imperator. This is the way the biographers suggest. While the written records both refer to the reluctance, the reticence of Charles the Great to adopt the title of imperator, the material production from the court of Charles, from the people around him, show a ready adoption, not only of the title, but of its significance. Being crowned the first medieval emperor offered Charles something that his predecessors did not have, which was access to the historical and mythical memory of the Roman emperors, and allowed a standing as a greater equal to those styled as emperor or basileus in Byzantine Constantinople. In image and object, Charles and his court sought to make the connections clear, and it was this act that later European kings and other emperors of other places, even in South America, would continue to revisit as they sought to celebrate Charles while confirming their own imperial ambitions. I skipped a slide. We could first turn to evidence from documents, from charters, from grants and judgments written in and around the court of Charles, in which he is described in the intitulatio, which is always under whose authority the document is produced. Following the year 800, Charles the Great is described as Carolus Serenissimus Augustus, Adeo Coronatus, Magnus Pacificus Imperator, Charles the Great and most serene Augustus, crowned by God, great and peaceful. An even stronger confirmation of his willingness to adopt the title and invoke the memory of Roman emperors is on display in the coin produced. If you haven't been following my English, this is great because now we're going to see a lot of coins. They'll speak for themselves. For some context, the first Carolingian king, Frankish king of the Carolingian dynasty, and the father of Charles the Great, Pippin the Short, reintroduced silver coinage to Francia, minting the first denarius, in more than 400 years. These coins were very simple in their design. On the obverse, containing the name of the king, in this case, a very simple RP for Rex Pippinus, the King Pippin, and on the reverse, either a title or the location of the mint, in this case, Lus, an abbreviation for Lugdunum, modern Leon. The early denarii of Charles followed on the model of his father, such as this example with Carolus. You can kind of see Carolus on the obverse, and in this case, RF for Rex Francorum, King of the Franks, on the reverse. I should note, this is an aside, that Charlemagne would do a major revision form coinage sometime around the 790s, but it's not clear as to what exactly he was attempting to change. I'll give you a few other examples of the coins he produced. These are all before 800, which is while he's just the king. He produced a coin like this. Like the text again, it says Carolus FR Francorum X with a cross, or more interestingly, a coin like this from Milan, in which you have the monogram. Monogram is here in the center of the coin, Carolus, and this was an innovation and the first of a really significant pattern of design changes that are adopting from late Roman, early Byzantine coinage. However, what we're going to see is something very radical. Following his imperial coronation, we find an entirely new iconography and text. These coins, although not widely minted as the other forms we've seen, were radical departures from their predecessors. First, in text, they focused on Charles the Great's new titles, Imperator Augustus, fully replicating the imperial nomenclature of the High Roman Empire. Second, in their image, they recall very particular imperial antecedents rather than contemporary ideas. This is remarkable, first, in that these portrait denarii were very different from those produced in the other empire, age, the Byzantine Empire, where faces were depicted frontally and the inscriptions were in Greek. And this example of a gold solidus depicts Charles's exact contemporary, the Empress Irene, who ruled Byzantium as a Vasilisa, 7 to 802, regent long before. This particular style here and its iconography had been dominant for 2 centuries. In fact, early Frankish coins looked a little bit like this. And they would continue to be very important for later Western Europe. But instead of doing this model, Charles looked to coins of the earlier emperors, emulating a style that had long fallen out of favor and necessitated a high level of technical skill in minting. This example of Marcus Aurelius suggests that the emulation was not just in the style of the portrait, but extended to the address, inscription, and overall the matrix of the coin. We can trace this survival of this kind of matrix with a frontal portrait surrounded by text. Throughout late antiquity, there's a silver liquid of Theodosius I from Leon. And unfortunately, we have to rely not on the denarius because there are no more denarii in the 4th century. But this is sort of the reinstitution of a silver coinage. All right. I probably did it. There are examples of the sort of the frontal portrait even into the 6th century, such as the golden trimestus of Justinian I, struck in Rome here. But these have become incredibly rare, and they're all being phased out in favor of a frontal portrait, as we see here, solidus of Justinian, and very much reminiscent of what we mean. When Charles the Great presented himself as Imperator Augustus, wearing the civic crown, clearly in Roman dress, he sought to define himself not just as an emperor, but in particular a Roman emperor in line with those of the 1st and 2nd century, and distant from the Greeks in Constantinople. This reflection back to an unforgotten yet remote mythical Rome extended beyond coins. It was in Carolingian monasteries that pagan texts from very imperial Rome were not only recopied, but valued and used. Scientific texts to those of a more esoteric nature, such as the works of Virgil. Love Virgil. This example is of a manuscript containing Virgil's Eclogue and Georgics. These are poetic texts, much about mythology and political philosophy as herding and farming. And I think what's important here is that the appearance of a great deal of marginal writing in many hands suggests the degree to which they were considered important, and important enough to warrant regular consultation and heavy annotation, using these Roman texts again and again. However, returning to objects, as is due in this talk, the only surviving statuary image from the reign of Charles the Great, although now perhaps attributed to Charles the Bald, depicts the king riding on a horse. Originally from the cathedral in Metz, but now in the Louvre, this bronze rider wore a heavy cloak, held in his hand an orbs, part of the imperial regalia, and an object frequently depicted as being carried by emperors. Also worth noting is while it referred back to Roman imperial models general form and arrangement. There are also innovative medieval elements. First, the crown, which was very much in line with contemporary 9th century depictions of royal headgear. If you think back to the two images of Frederick I and Frederick II, they're wearing these very similar crowns. This is the crown of Italy, something like that. Second, holding a sword, which is visible here in this photo from the 19th century, sort of vanished sometime in the middle of the 20th century. Know why? This element was clearly an innovation and reinforced the military nature of his successes. Finally, Charles the Great is depicted with a distinctly non-Roman style of facial hair. Wonderful mustache, exaggerated mustache, something that was also visible on the coin of Charlemagne. Portrait, very visible mustache. But in comparison to the only surviving equestrian statue from antiquity, again, that of Marcus Aurelius, parallels are clear and intentional. Although only a small audience of nobles and elites in the Frankish kingdom would have had access to the original bronze statue in Rome, and perhaps thought the writer to have been Constantine rather than Marcus Aurelius, without question, they would have understood Charles as having placed himself in iconographic succession with his Roman predecessor, without the aid of anything else. There's no text necessary to connect these two figures. Except as an aside, this is an enormous statue. This is 3 meters tall. This is 1 meter tall. Very small emperor. But even in death, imperial connection forming and networking would continue. On the 28th January 814, Charles the Great, the first emperor in almost 400 years, died. Reactions were varied, and one, known as the Planctus de Obitu Caroli, or a lament of the death of Charles, written by an anonymous monk from the imperial monastery of Bobbio in Italy, captured the universality of its impact. People of the empire, men and women, Franks and Romans, extending to the author himself, who was miserable, and eventually the founder of the monastery Columbanus. In the end, the Planctus specifically seeks Christ to welcome the soul of Charles as if it was the apostles. But throughout all of the stanzas, the author also seeks to bring in elements that clearly represent the secular elements that were commemorated at Charles' death. From the rising of the sun on the seashores to where it sets, lamentation beats upon the hearts of men. Alas for me, my misery. The Franks and the Romans, all believers, are stung with mourning and great worry. Alas for me, my misery. Continues on a few stanzas later. Young and old, glorious bishops and matrons, all lament the loss of their emperor, their Caesar in this case. Alas for me and my misery. And it ends the final stanza. O Christ, receive into your holy dwelling among your apostles the pious Charles. Alas for me, misery. What I wish to highlight here is that within what is clearly a spiritual and Christian request, the monk of Bobbio has incorporated, to a great extent, Charles's secular life, his past, or at least a number of aspects of it. The breadth of his empire, east and west, diversity of the people, Franks and Romans, all lament the death of the very own emperor, rendered in Latin as Caesar. At the same time, the emperor was expected to be accepted by Christ as an apostle. While safely nestled inside a Planctus composed almost immediately after his death, these two ideas of an emperor on the one hand and almost a saint on the other, become central references to attempts at later memorialization of objects. Now comes the fun stuff. I would like to pivot back to objects that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, where there are tensions, or rather different memorial strands that are brought together, and in this case, in the reliquary of the arm of Charlemagne. And this is probably very difficult to see. So I'm just going to give you an ekphrasis. You have 5 panels on the front, 5 panels on the rear, 2 panels on the ends, about 15 centimeters tall, 15 centimeters wide, 50 centimeters long. It's a long box, not too long. It is now superseded by the next object we'll talk about, which is a massive and programmatic reliquary casket in Aachen made by the grandson Frederick II. The reign of Frederick Barbarossa, when this was created, saw a concentrated attempt to reposition Charlemagne as both imperial progenitor and as a Christian saint. It's represented in this object, a reliquary designed to just have the arm, at least this part of the arm, of Charlemagne, and produced sometime between 1165 and the mid-1170s in Liège, following Charles the Great's canonization. All right. Its arrangement of image and very simple text, each of these panels has a label, is unlike that of, not too far unlike that of the sarcophagi and tombs of the ages, but in many ways it also transcends the iconography of these traditional relics. Yet it was made with specific memorializing purposes, and it is worth considering how and at what level it contributes to different kinds of imperial commemoration. All right. We'll start with this one. On the front panel, we have an image of the infant Christ and the Virgin, flanked by the angels Michael and Gabriel, and further flanked by the patrons of the. On one side, Frederick I Barbarossa, and on the other side, his wife, Beatrix of Burgundy. Their poses with the orbs and gestures, the figure of the Virgin and the infant Christ, clearly designate their roles as patrons, at least iconographically. The titles above their heads, reminiscent kind of earlier coins, maybe, reaffirm their secular authority. Frederick is Imperator Romanorum, Augustus, while Beatrix was Imperatrix Romanorum and Augusta, titles she received not through marriage to Frederick, although it helped, but she received her very own papal coronation by Paschal III on the 1st of August, 1167. An act, unfortunately, later nullified a decade later on account of Paschal's irregular election. He was in fact declared an anti-pope. But this is very helpful as it gives us a decade in which the title was being used, and so we can date the item very precisely. It was also a decade in which Frederick I engaged in political struggles across his growing empire. This is, again, an empire that is Germany and Italy, and including now Burgundy, where Frederick I sought to reinforce his legitimacy by tapping into the memory of his imperial predecessors. And so while the front is informative about the identities and perhaps aspirations of the donors, it reveals very little about the object. What are we supposed to do with this? Unfortunately, we're also not helped by the other side in regards, which depicts Christ, adult Christ, flanked by Peter and Paul, the Roman apostles, with Frederick's father, Conrad III, who had been crowned by king of the Romans by Anselm of Milan in 1128. And when Conrad was able to succeed his grandfather, IV, it's Henry IV who's very important here because he represents a different dynasty. And Henry IV has also elevated Frederick to be the first Hohenstaufen Duke of Swabia. So this is Frederick I's father and Frederick I's grandfather. This is very helpful. These identifications and the political context, I think, are essential for making sense of this panel. The first side was the donors, And the second ties Frederick to the biological line of succession. Great. But what's in the box? You know what's in the box, but gotta do one more thing. A different kind of succession is reflected on the ends of the reliquary box. Now imagine you're walking, you have to walk all the way around the object to read what's going on. All right, so you get to the ends. And we find two portraits of Frederick I's imperial predecessors, Louis the Pious and Otto III. While not the founders of their lines, they were both mythologized even in their own reigns, with attributes that Frederick wanted the audience of the box to recall, to remember. Louis was emperor and pious, while Otto III was the strongest originator of the ideology of restoration, revival, renewal of the empire, the Renovatio Imperii, and as such, a wonder of the earth. Further still, it offers visual continuity from the Carolingians to the next dynasty, the Ottonians, and to the newly established Hohenstaufens. And we can do this by, we have to think about the poses. The pose is identical between Louis the Pious, Otto, and if we go back one, Conrad. You're tying together three individuals. Yet again, nothing about these panels provides us, the audience, with the ultimate function of the box. It is only when the case is opened that we get to see its purpose. Gotta open the box. And in this case, it holds the arm of the most holy and glorious Emperor Charles the Great. So you open the lid, and inside of the lid is the inscription that describes the context. Amazing. In creating an enclosing object in which the text is hidden and must be revealed, for an inner relic which was labeled but not represented, Frederick forces a kind of intimacy between the viewer and the intended memorialization. We're getting there. In this case, not only does the object demand a close inspection to discover its main purpose, but you need to be very close. There's a very short distance to identify the portraits. And this occurs because without a uniform secular iconography, the inscriptions become essential in guiding the viewer in establishing the imperial, on the one hand, imperial genealogy, from Carolingian to Ottonian, and then the Hohenstaufen genealogy, from Frederick the Duke to Conrad III to Frederick I Emperor. The importance of the predecessors in establishing legitimacy is not immediately clear, but must also be made by the awareness of the viewer. You need to know the context in order for the object to make sense. I think most likely the instant recognition of Christ and the Virgin, of angels and of saints, Peter and Paul, announce the function of the object. It's a relic, of course, but the other panels complicate the position. It is both a holy relic and a means for a purely imperial commemoration simultaneously. A box for the arm of the Christian saint and for the glorious emperor. Even the organization of the figures of the panel make uncertain which elements, secular or sacred, I can give you this, are designed to be seen as the most relevant. As you walk around, clearly Christ on one side, the Virgin on the other, but on the ends you have emperors. So you kind of walk around and different things become important as you view the object in different ways. Now, this was an amazing object, but Charles the Great himself would have never imagined a casket for his remains in this form. Instead, the projection of his identity as tied to that of his Roman predecessors was strong, and it was likely this what was on his mind, what he considered for his own burial. And his choice was a late antique sarcophagus from Rome. Devoid of overly Christian motifs, of actually any Christian motifs, it features a pagan and mythological figural scene, that of the rape of Proserpina, and was crafted in Italy and was brought to the capital Aachen, presumably in the 9th century. The lack of overt Christian references carried over to the literary funeral epitaph for Charles that was recorded in Einhard's biography, the Vita Caroli Magni, as it contains only one reference to his religion. So there's a wonderful epitaph for Charlemagne, highlights his military prowess, his successes, but it only once does it mention his faith. He's Magnus atque Orthodoxus Imperator, Charles the Great and Orthodox Emperor. At the end of his life, first medieval emperor sought to adopt something that resembled Roman secular funerary commemoration, a fact that stands as an important attribute at the point of Charles's death in 814. His body, of course, as we've already seen, would not remain untouched. During the course of the reign of the Emperor Otto, Charles's tomb would be opened and personal effects, a book he was buried with, and some clothes would be removed. But it was not until the 1160s that real efforts to sanctify and transform his remains took place. The first occurred in 1165, when Frederick I forced through the canonization of Charles by Pope Paschal III. So on the 29th of December, 1165, with the blessing of the Pope, the translatio was witnessed by various princes and church officials. Charles the Great was solemnly canonized and declared a saint. He was honored on the 28th of January. Justification was presented in the following year in 2 diplomas that Frederick I offered, which clearly connected the current emperor to Charlemagne's model of rule, contending that Frederick, and I'm going to quote the diploma, had the foremost desire and intention to follow in the manner of living and ruling those divine kings and emperors who preceded us, especially the great and glorious Charles. It is explicit in text that Frederick I is looking to Charles as a model in both his living, both the divineness and actually the secularity. And despite the intention to inter Charles, and this was Frederick I, it would not be until the reign of his grandson, Frederick II, that the relics would be enshrined and available for large-scale commemoration and veneration in the form of the reliquary known as the Karl Shrine, located in Aachen's Cathedral. Now, just another bit of tangentiality. This is slightly more than 2 meters long. So we've gone from a small box of 0.5 meter to 2 meters. So it's a massive artifact. And it's full of details. I'm going to share some with you. Like the reliquary box made by his grandfather, the Karl Shrine was overtly political, an overtly political object, created at an important time in the reign of Frederick II. It was made sometime around 1215, with the translatio taking place on the 27th of July, the first anniversary of the Battle of Louvain, which led to the abdication of his rival Otto IV and his eventual coronation as King of the Romans in 1215, leading ultimately to his imperial coronation in 1220. So just to be clear, this object is made when Frederick II is very young. He had a rival from a different family, Otto. He was able to force Otto to abdicate when Otto tried to invade France. And in that moment, the world opens up. And Frederick II sees a path both to his own coronation, and in this case, he's coronated as the Rex Romanorum, the King of the Romans, and then later he'll have his own imperial coronation. So he's not yet an emperor. Also, like the reliquary box of Frederick I, it invested a great deal in tying together image and text to commemorate various types of imperial commemoration, but in a way that did not necessitate any activity other than observation. Once the remains of Charlemagne had been interred in the shrine, they were there until the 1980s. So this box served a purpose. Charlemagne was in the box. We know it because we have labels that tell us exactly its purpose. So, although both the reliquaries of Frederick I and II share commonalities, it is worth exploring how the Karl Shrine, recapitulates imperial connections, reiterates imperial connections, and indeed offers a clear separation between Charles holy and Charles who is imperial. It is also a monument with far more information than its predecessor, with text both in the form of additional labels and in descriptions and the purpose of the vessel, and an image with small scenes in relief on the lid from the mythic life of Charles the Great that have become more common. So just to point out, You have labels around all of these are figures of emperors and kings. You have text underneath the lid. You have text underneath the figures. You have these wonderful reliefs from the life of Charles. This is really the 12th century life of Charles. It's Chanson de Roland, right? And in here, it also has text. So there's text describing everything. It also includes part of the will of Charlemagne. It's really, there's Charles the Great, there's a lot going on. All right, so unlike the reliquary box we saw before, the main focus is not on these two long panels, but rather on the shorter ends. One features an enthroned virgin between the angels Michael and Gabriel, as we saw with the box, while the other features something very interesting. Charles the Great with two of his contemporaries, Pope Leo and Turpin of Ram, with Christ appearing above them. So the labels are simple in their identifications. Holy Leo, Pope; Holy Charles, Emperor; Holy Turpin, Bishop. However, around Christ, a much more elaborate sentiment is revealed. So what I'm going to focus on, you can see beautiful text here coming up and around. So we have on the margins this very interesting text. You have been the light, the jewel of the Church of Christ, Charles, the flower of kings, the ornament of the earth, and the pathway of laws. Beyond this interesting juxtaposition of parallels, jewel of the church, flower of the king, ornament of the earth, path of laws, the inclusion of the episcopal figures, in this case, Pope Leo and Turpin, are the only, and these episcopal figures are the only ones on the body of the Charles shrine. Everyone else are the kings or emperors. They have an interesting effect. They allow us to acknowledge the piety and sanctity of Charles, the differences. He's clearly separated from the leaders of the church. He's not the Pope, he's not a bishop, he's an emperor. This was not, I think, only intentional, but was echoed in all the other imperial representations along with the panels, who are either identified as Rex Romanorum, King of the Romans, or Imperator Romanorum, the Emperor. One side, and these are the very long sides. I could show you each individual image, but you don't need that. Henry III, Zwentibold, Henry V, Henry IV, Otto IV, Henry I, Lothar, and Louis the Pious. On one side. On the other side is mixed again with another imperial group. Henry II, Otto III, Otto I, Otto II, Charles the Fat, an unnamed emperor, where the text has been lost, but almost certainly Frederick I, Henry VI, and finally Frederick II. We can go here. In this litany of emperors all along the long sides, Charles the Great was obviously the first, and because he's on one end, the most important. Despite the long history of Roman emperors, including Constantine, who had converted to Christianity in the 4th century, Charles was the originator of the idea of the medieval emperor. When Frederick II interred Charles's body in the Charles shrine, he was still 5 years away from himself becoming emperor. And as his own inscription notes, simply Rex Francorum et Siciliae, king of the Romans and of Sicily. Yet, like Charles the Great, and in part because of the legacy of Charles the Great, Frederick II also looked beyond the Carolingians to imperial models from the earlier empire. Picking up ideas of imperial renewal and renovation that had circulated since the Ottonians, notably Otto III, Frederick marked his own coronation with imperial Roman imagery that was ultimately not directly mediated by Charles the Great. Almost done. You've done a fantastic job. Thank you. So, most noticeably of this adoption of imperial imagery are the coins he mints in his Sicilian realm in southern Italy, which not only reaffirm his title of Frederick, Emperor of the Romans, Caesar Augustus, but also replicated a highly technical style that had actually become almost impossible. So they're making very, very fine molds, for stamping these coins. And we can actually see it's beautiful. So, Federicus, right? Imp Rome, Cais Aug. Imperator Romanorum, Caesar Augustus. And here he is again. This is, if we take a look, this is a coin that is, oh, I've jumped ahead. You know it's coming. That actually replicates with the civic crown, the Roman cloak, exactly the coin that we saw with Charlemagne. And yet it's finer, it's a better quality, and more evocative than what we've seen since. Oh. Although this coin did not circulate widely, they mark the beginning of renewed interest in imitating and adopting imperial iconography with a closer fidelity to the Roman originals. And critical here, this is devoid of sacral kingship, Christian references, and other things visible in popular media, coins, tombs, inscriptions, and documents. So we find again that break, that split. What is more important isn't the sacral kingship, but is the succession following on the Roman Empire. But of course, you know, renewed imperial style would, in fact, never fall out of favors. Following his own coronation on the 1st of December in 1822, Pedro I of Brazil authorized the minting of new coins. Depicted here on a gold coin in profile, again wearing a civic crown, and styled as Brasiliae Imperator, we would be forgiven if we simply looked back to the coins of the 1st and 2nd century, like that of Marcus Aurelius. Like this we see as the natural progression. But in fact, even though there's no direct mediator, it would not have been possible to make this connection without the memory and image of Charles the Great, the first medieval emperor to reclaim the terms and symbols of empire. Thank you.
Thank you. Bom, vamos abrir então para perguntas, comentários, dúvidas, e a gente faz um esquema aqui de tradução e negociação da conversa. Então, alguém gostaria de fazer uma pergunta? Carol? Oh.
Hello.
Ok. Eu fico aqui embaixo para...
Okay. What would you propose as an interpretation as to why there is this apparent, well, it's not apparent, actually, this contradiction between the textual narrative, especially with Eginhard claiming that Charlemagne did not want the title, and the fact that the material evidence shows quite the opposite. How would you advance some kind of justification for these two interpretations, more or less?
Eu só, como ele disse que a tradição textual, principalmente com o Eginhard, as biografias do Carlos Magno, tendem a colocá-lo sempre uma certa aversão ao título de imperador, e como ele mostrou na cultura material, isso não acontece. Ele se apropriou desse título e usou. Então, o que ele indicaria como uma interpretação possível para essa contradição ou esse conflito de narrativas?
That's an excellent question. And I think the answer is situated in the context of the Carolingian Empire after the death of Charlemagne. So both Einhard and Nachter are writing for people, Charlemagne's son and grandsons, who have become emperors themselves. And there's this idea that it's not something you want to take, it's an obligation, it's a responsibility. And it's also very complicated because what happens with Charlemagne's grandsons, and I'm sure all of you know this or will know this soon, is that Louis the Pious, who we've seen is centrally important, he's an emperor. He has children who divide up his empire, and each of them become a king. Right? He has 3 children, then one dies, and he replaces him. So you have Lothar with Lotharingia, Louis the German in Germany, and Charles the Bald in Francia, and each of them is a king. but only one can be emperor. So I think the biographers are keeping this in mind, that it's not, it's nice to be emperor, but it's not really important. I mean, that's the literary sort of convention, but it is critical. It allows you this enormous depth, this continuity. And the person missing here, and I think there are a number of things I did not mention, and we could talk about sacral kingship under the Capetians in France. Notice I did not mention that at all, but it's something I think the Holy Roman Emperors are doing very differently. The other thing that I've not mentioned is Constantine. They're the first Christian Roman emperor who, in Battle of Milvian Bridge and 312 and the Edict of Milan, right? This should be the emperor that is referred to, but he's not. And so I think there's a freedom in connecting to a imperial past that is not Christian, but it's a little dangerous to do that. But I think it's more, there's a greater efficacy in suggesting it. It's sort of, Constantine is wonderful, but after Constantine, things don't get better. But you can look to the reigns of Hadrian or Marcus Aurelius, even Nero, but you probably don't want that, as models for representations of power. That's I think really it's seductive, and that's why Charles the Great, Carlos Magno, so quickly adopts it. And it's planned. I mean, he says, have you all ever had a surprise party, but you know about it, and you have to pretend to be surprised? I think it's very much like that. This is something that's programmatic. It's the year 800. It's Christmas. It's very intentional. There's this very strange, it's almost discordant, what you see.
Connected also to creating associating a little bit to an image of humility. If it's in the construction also of the saintly image of Charlemagne. So refusing or not wanting this title in a way approaches him to Christ himself.
Absolutely. And it's didactic for Charlemagne's son and grandson. So Louis the Pious, Ludovicus Pius, is not pious, right? That's his problem. And so this is a way to sort of suggest, hey, look how great your dad was. So yeah, that's exact. But it's also imitato Christi. So there's a lot that's going on as well.
Mais perguntas? Não sejam tímidos. Bem.
Eu teria uma pergunta um pouco mais pontual. A moeda que você mostrou, nessa moeda de Carlos Magno e na moeda também de do Antonino Pio, você diz que existe uma influência direta, mas no caso do Carlos Magno, ele está usando o manto militar. Haveria também uma influência da iconografia imperial tardo-antiga dos séculos IV e V?
No, that's exactly right. So the military cloak is a later innovation. So what we're looking at here is this element, right? This is you're wearing it almost like a cloak or a cape, and it's what generals wear, and it's not necessarily imperial until we're well into the late 3rd century, probably the 4th century. So it is that innovation, and yet in its simplicity, I mean, because what the other thing is the nomenclature for late antique emperors is amazing, right? You're Augustus, you're glorious, you're Domini Nostri, right? You have a lot going on, and in fact, because we can, let's just go back to an example. I love examples. So many coins, right? I mean, so Dominus Nostris, Theodosius, PF, right? So Pius Felix, or however we want to interpret that, Augustus. So there's a lot more that Charlemagne is not, Charles the Great is not taking. He is taking that. He is taking the civic crown. In part, it gets a little more complicated because when you see by the time you get to the 6th century, that the emperors rarely do this. And what you see instead is even more militaristic. So you're wearing the cursus, you're wearing your chest plate, you're holding an orbs, and that becomes much, much more common. And so you're right, he's taking things achronologically, just pulling what he thinks of as essential. But, so we could say perhaps he's looking at this, but I think the models are much more imperial than sort of this late antique other. Did I understand your question?
Yeah. Obrigada. Mais alguma pergunta? Eu tenho uma perguntinha mais teórica. Vou falar primeiro em português, depois eu traduzo. Quando você analisa os dois relicários, né, do Frederico I e o Frederico II, fica muito claro que é uma mudança de intenção do objeto. Então, eu queria que se você pudesse comentar um pouco mais da questão de como que esses objetos eram, de fato, utilizados e como esses textos e essas imagens eram percebidos pelos observadores, porque tem realmente uma mudança ali. So, when you were discussing the two reliquaries, they were very different in size and in how you deal with them as an observant. And I would like for you to talk a little bit more, if there's hypotheses or explanations regarding to that, on how these objects were actually used and who had access to them and how they functioned in the material sense, and how the interactions between the observer and the object and the text and the image.
That's an excellent question. And so this is the secret part is that Frederick I was successful in the canonization of Charlemagne, but unsuccessful in patterns of veneration. This is this object is a little bit too small and too complicated. And it ends up in the Palatine Chapel. This is where Charlemagne built for himself a church to house the relics that he had gotten from other saints, where all the later kings who call themselves Rex Romanorum, not Imperator, but Rex Romanorum, are coronated in Aachen. And this is designed to be part of that process. So it's really an object of political, much more political ceremony than religious ceremony. But it's also a little bit unclear where it was. By the time you get to this thing, this is part of in fact, the 13th century is the apex for these large kinds of reliquaries. And there are actually two by this workshop in Aachen. There's one of Marian relics, which is amazing. I mean, it's actually, I think the fabrication is better than this. Huge. And these are essentially, they become parts of the altar. They sit in positions on or near the altar. So they are central to the performance of liturgy. And it's interesting because Charlemagne is a saint after 1165, but there are other emperor saints. So Henry II is a really good example of an emperor saint. And those happen. The emperor dies, and immediately he's canonized. We see this later with Louis IX, right? So Saint Louis, he dies, he's a saint. This is something where you're going back to someone who there's another strand that I didn't mention, in which Charlemagne has some things that he does in his life that people know about and they very much frown upon. So at his death, there's no effort for canonization. And in fact, there are a number of texts that are really derogatory towards Charles the Great. And so this is an effort, I think, to force commemoration and to say, oh, well, look, on one side you've got the Virgin, on the other side you've got Charles the Great, and Christ is above Charles the Great, so we can see this vertical line. He's intercessory. You guys have seen, here. He's intercessory, right? The line, you've been to a church, right? You've got a cross and you got someone underneath the cross, and that's the intercessory line. This is very famous if you think about late antiquity. So the Church of Ravenna, like Apollinaris, you have Apollinaris, and right above Apollinaris is the transfigured cross. Well, this is the idea, is you've got Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and such a key figure, and he's right below Christ. So he's an intercessory figure, he's a saint, but it's a political monument and used for political purposes. This is part of the Holy Roman Empire's imperial coronation. Models of iconography all stem from this monument. So this monument is used as it was intended. If you have you don't know what movie's on my Netflix until you open it up. You're like, oh, right, great. So that's the problem with the box. The box is you don't even know what's in it because the label's not there. So it's a much more intimate, but it limits the availability, the access. Whereas this is really designed to amaze you with its high level of production, and then also to remind you of the connections between emperors and Christ, but at the same time they're separated, which I think is also very key. They're not together in the way you find some other models of really penitent emperors with proskynesis on their knees. You've seen this as donors. This, I think, is suggesting, very often we see Christ enthroned. This is not Christ enthroned, this is Charles.
Thank you. Mais alguma pergunta? Bom, então, acho que nós vamos encerrar a nossa sessão e agradecemos novamente ao professor Edward Schoolman pela presença e vamos fazer então uma salva de palmas.
Obrigado.